Part 1. Strategic Doctrine: Winning Without War. Point number 1. Core Principle: Victory without engagement. The foundational doctrine underlying the behavior of the People's Republic of China is not built around battlefield supremacy but around systematic control. The objective is not to defeat an enemy militarily but to make conflict unnecessary. This aligns directly with the central maxim of the art of war. The highest form of victory is to settle and subdue the enemy without fighting him. It is not a philosophical rhetoric, it is an operational doctrine. War introduces volatility, coalition responses, capital destruction, and internal instability. Avoiding war while achieving equivalent outcome is a strictly superior strategy in a cost-benefit analysis. China's approach optimizes for asymmetry, maximum gain with minimal overt resistance. Point number 2. Strategic substitution from force to systems. Traditional powers, particularly like the United States, project influence through military presence, alliances, and coercive capability. China substitutes this with structural embedding. Instead of controlling territory directly, it seeks to control the systems that territory depends on. This includes trading routes, supply chains, financial flows, digital infrastructure. Control of this system produces equivalent leverage to territorial occupation without triggering defensive alliance or insurgency. Failure to recognize this substitution leads to analytical error. Observers measure aircraft carriers while ignoring port ownership, data routing, and commodity dependencies. Point number 3. Time horizons. Long-term positional warfare. China operates on extended timelines. Unlike electoral democracies which are constrained by short political cycles, the Chinese state, under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party, executes multi-decade strategies. This produces a structural advantage. Projects that appear unprofitable in the short term are pursued for long-term leverage. Strategic patience allows gradual encirclement rather than rapid confrontation. Opponents misinterpret incremental moves as isolated events rather than components of a unified strategy. This method resembles positional warfare rather than maneuver warfare. Gains are cumulative, not explosive. Point number 4. Ambiguity as a strategic tool. China deliberately maintains ambiguity in its intentions. Policies are framed as economic cooperation, development assistance, or technological advancement. The absence of overt aggression reduces resistance. This ambiguity functions in 3 layers. Diplomatic layer. Projects are presented as mutually beneficial partnerships. Economic layer. Investments are framed as development rather than leverage. Strategic layer. Military expansion is justified as defensive. The result is delayed reaction from competitors. By the time intent becomes visible, structural dependencies are already in place. Point number 4. Cost avoidance and risk management. War is inefficient. It destroys infrastructure, disrupts trade, and risks regime stability. China's doctrine minimizes exposure to these risks. Instead of direct confrontation, it applies pressure through market access restrictions, regulatory leverage, supply chain manipulation. These instruments impose cost on adversaries without triggering formal conflict thresholds. The opponent experiences pressure, but it lacks a clear casus belli. Second order effects, adversaries struggle to justify escalation. Third order effects, China accumulates advantage without retaliation. Point number 6. Fragmentation of opposition. A direct war unifies opposition. A slow distributed strategy fragments it. China engages countries bilaterally rather than confronting blocs. Through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, relationships are individualized. Each country negotiates based on its own incentives, not as a part of a coordinated resistance. This produces divergent interests among political components. Reduced likelihood of collective action, increased bargaining power for China. This system prevents the formation of a unified counter strategy. Point number 7. Redefinition of power. Traditional definitions of power, territory, military size, nuclear capability are insufficient in this framework. China's doctrine expands power into control over interdependence. Power becomes the ability to disrupt supply chains, control capital access, set technological standards, influence regulatory environments. In this model, dominance is achieved when other states cannot function efficiently without already provided systems. Strategic outcome, invisible domain. This The end state of this doctrine is not visible conquest but embedded dependence. Countries retain formal sovereignty but operate within systems shaped by China. This creates a hierarchy without explicit empire. No occupation forces, no formal annexations, no declared victories. Yet outcomes mirror imperial control, policy influence, economic dependence, and strategic alignment. Structural implication. China's strategy cannot be understood if it is treated as a normal, short term foreign policy program. That is weak reading. China's behavior comes from a deeper strategic and structural aspect. Long memory, civilizational continuity, centralized authority, fear of internal disorder, preference for indirect victory. The core mistake many analysts make is assuming China thinks like a Western electoral state. It does not. Its strategic psychology is shaped by imperial history, the century of humiliation, revolutionary struggle, economic rebuilding, and one party rule. That produces a state that values patience, concealment, leverage, and sequencing. China is not trying to win in a dramatic Hollywood sense. It is trying to make international systems increasingly dependent on Chinese capacity, Chinese capital, Chinese markets, Chinese infrastructure, and Chinese political consent. This is the real doctrine, not conquest, but indispensability. Sun Tzu and the logic of non-combat victory. The most famous strategic foundation is Sun Tzu's principle that the best victory is achieved without fighting. This idea is often quoted lazily, but its actual strategic meaning is severe. It means that the greatest commander doesn't merely win battles, he destroys the opponent's position before battle becomes necessary. In this framework, war is not the highest expression of power. War is evidence that earlier instruments failed. China's modern strategy reflects this logic. Instead of immediately using military power, it uses preparatory instruments: trade, debt, ports, standards, technology, industrial dependence, diplomatic access, and narrative control. These do not look like weapons. They may alter the enemy's range of movement. A country dependent on Chinese manufacturing cannot easily confront China. A company dependent on Chinese consumers cannot freely criticize China. A government dependent on Chinese infrastructure financing cannot easily resist Chinese diplomatic demands. This is Sun Tzu applied to globalization. The battlefield has shifted. The army is now container chips, telecom networks, rare earth processing facilities, development banks, port operators, and industrial subsidies. Imperial strategic memory, centrality, hierarchy, and order. For much of its history, China understood itself not as a one state among equals, but as a central civilization around which regional order revolved. This doesn't mean modern China is simply occupying or copying the imperial tribute system. That would be too simplistic, but the memory of centrality matters. The imperial world produced several lasting instincts. First, China prefers hierarchy over disorder. It is more comfortable with structured relationship where weaker states understand the limits of their autonomy. Second, China values buffer zones. Historically, threats come from frontiers, nomadic powers, maritime intrusions, internal rebellion. Modern equivalents include Taiwan, the South China Sea, Central Asia, the Korean Peninsula. Third, China sees unity as survival. Fragmentation is not treated as ordinary political pluralism, it is treated as existential danger. This is why Beijing's posture toward Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea is so rigid. They are not mere political issues, they are treated as sovereignty nerves. The state cannot appear weak there without risking internal and external challenges. The century of humiliation, strategic trauma as fuel. China's modern strategic psychology is heavily shaped by the period often called as the century of humiliation, beginning with Western and Japanese imperial pressure in the 19th century, continuing into the early 20th century. The memory is not decorative, it is politically weaponized. The lesson absorbed by the Chinese state is brutal. Weakness invites partition, foreign control, unequal treaties, economic extraction, and national humiliation. This produces a permanent obsession with sovereignty, military modernization, industrial capacity, and resistance to foreign pressure. It also explains why China is hypersensitive to perceived encirclement by US alliances, naval patrol, sanctions, technological restrictions. From Beijing's perspective, dependency equals vulnerability. The correct response is not trust. The correct response is self-strengthening. This is why China invests so heavily in domestic industrial capacity, semiconductor independence, naval expansion, space systems, AI, surveillance, and alternative financial channels. They are not isolated projects, they are anti-humiliation infrastructure. Maoist legacy, struggle, mobilization, and political control. Maoist China was poorer and more isolated than today's China, but it contributed several lasting strategic traits. The first is the centrality of political control. The Communist Party learned that survival depends on controlling ideology, institutions, security apparatus, and mass mobilization. The party doesn't see itself as a political anchor among many, it sees itself as the organizational spine of the nation. The second is the concept of protracted struggle. Maoist doctrine normalized long campaigns, ideological endurance, and the idea that weaker forces can defeat stronger enemies through patience and mobilization. The third is suspicion of foreign domination. Even when China later opened economically, it never fully adopted the assumption that integration meant trust. It treated integration as useful but dangerous. This is essential. China joined the global economy but didn't surrender the party state. It absorbed market tools without accepting liberal political discipline. This is why Western assumptions failed. Many believed economic opening would inevitably produce political liberalization. China extracted their economic benefit and rejected the political conversion. This was not an accident, it was disciplined statecraft. Deng Xiaoping, strategic patience and economic power first. Under Deng Xiaoping, Mao strategy transformed China's method. The goal was no longer permanent revolutionary confrontation. The goal was accumulation of national power through economic development. The slogan, often associated with Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy era, which is hide your strength, bide your time. Through the exact phase, attribution are debated. The broader Deng Xiang era strategic line emphasized calm observations, maintaining positions, low profile behavior, avoiding premature leadership claims. This mattered because Deng understood sequencing. A poor China could not be dominated. A weak China could not dictate terms. A technologically backward China could not challenge the United States. Therefore, the first task was not confrontation. The first task was capability accumulation. Deng's doctrine can be reduced to one cold formula: grow first, challenge later. This is why many rivals miscalculated. They saw China's low profile as moderation. In reality, it was incubation. China entered global markets, attracted foreign investments, and became the world's factory, accumulated foreign reserves, learned from Western firms, built infrastructure, upgraded industrial capacity. By the time other powers recognized the scale of this shift, dependency had already formed. The strategic genius of Deng's period was restrained. China didn't introduce or needed waste its rise on premature conflict. Jiang and Hu, integration without submission. Under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, China deepened global integration while maintaining party control. This was quite consolidation period. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, expanded exports, absorbed manufacturing capacity, and became increasingly central to global supply chains. The external image remained relatively cautious compared with the Xi era. The internal logic, however, was accumulation. The period created China's most important strategic asset, industrial gravity. Once global firms became supply chains around China, leaving them expensive. Once consumers depended on cheap Chinese goods, inflation pressures discouraged decoupling. Once corporations earned profits from Chinese markets, they became political pressure against confrontation. This was not conquest, it was integration as leverage. The failure of Western strategy was assuming that China's participation in global institutions would discipline China. Instead, China used global institutions to scale itself. The Xi era marks a shift from strategic concealment to strategic assertion. China no longer behaves like a rising power asking for space. It behaves like a greater power demanding recognitions. Xi's framework includes the Belt and Road Initiative, military modernization, technology self-reliance, stronger party control, new diplomatic concepts such as the Global Security Initiative. Xi proposed the Global Security Initiative in 2022, presenting China as a promoter of common security and cooperation rather than a Western-style alliance bloc leader. This shift doesn't mean China abandoned patience. It means China believes that it has accumulated enough power to be less differential. The Belt and Road Initiative is central here. Official Chinese sources present the BRI as a global cooperation and development platform. Critics and strategic analysts often interpret it as a geopolitical infrastructure network that expands China's influence through transport, energy, finance, and trade corridors. The core difference between Deng and Xi is timing. Deng minimizes visibility to build strength. Xi increases visibility to convert strength into influence. The party state mindset. Control before legitimacy. Liberal states often seek legitimacy through open consent, elections, and institutional pluralism. The Chinese Communist Party seeks legitimacy through performance, nationalism, stability, development, and control. This produces a different hierarchy of priorities. Political stability comes before individual freedom. National unity becomes more distant. State capacity comes before procedural openness. Economic development comes before ideological softness. Security becomes transparency. This is why China can execute long-term strategies in a way many democracies cannot. It doesn't need constant electoral permission for each strategic step. It can subsidize sectors for decades, tolerate inefficient projects if they serve strategic goals, coordinate banks, firms, ministries, local governments, and military institutions under a national plan. But there is also a vulnerability. Centralized systems cannot move fast, but they can also suppress bad information. They can mobilize resources, but they cannot overbuild, overcontrol, and punish truth telling. A system obsessed with control can become strategically blind. That weakness matters, but it doesn't erase the strength itself. It only defines the risk profile. China rarely frames its action as coercion, it frames them as development, sovereignty, stability, non interference, or mutual benefit. The language is soft, the structure is hard. That is the central pattern. A port is presented as a development, later it becomes a logistical influence. A telegram network is presented as modernization, later it becomes data dependency. A trade relationship is presented as a mutual growth, later it becomes market leverage. A diplomatic partnership is presented as a multipolar fairness, later it becomes alignment against Western pressure. China's method is not to force states into submission immediately, it is to create conditions under which resistance becomes expensive. This is how quiet power works. It doesn't need applause, it needs dependency. A major structural advantage China exploits is the mismatch between its own planning horizon and the short political cycle of its rivals. Democratic governments often think in election cycles, corporations think in quarter earnings, media systems think in daily controversy. China thinks in 5-year plans, generational industrial upgrading, and long-term geopolitical positioning. This gives China an advantage in slow competitions. Infrastructure, industrial policy, logistics, education, technology absorption, and diplomatic relationship building. The West often reacts after consequences become visible. China acts while consequences are still invisible. That is the difference between tactical response and strategic positioning. The real historical lesson. The historical lesson is not that China is unbeatable. That is childish and ambitious. China has serious constraints: demographics, debt, over-centralization, youth unemployment, regional distrust, and coalition resistance. The real lesson is sharper. China's rise is not improvised. It is rooted in a long tradition of indirect power, state centrality, historical grievances, and strategic patience, and party-led mobilization. This is why China can win without war. It doesn't need to conquer every state. It only needs to become the unavoidable node in the systems those states depends on. Formal empire is obsolete. Structural dependency is cleaner.